This is Lecture 6, Part 1, and in this lecture I will be covering the emergency support functions. In Part 2 I'll be hitting emergency management teams and the United States Department of Homeland Security. In the last lecture I told you that discussing the National Response Framework before the ESFs was a more logical sequence, and this is because the emergency support functions are included within the NRF. So using the graphic from the previous lecture, I added ESFs under the NRF to illustrate their place in the national preparedness goal. I mentioned that the NRF is a guide for federal response to disasters. Well, ESFs are a continuation of that principle. ESFs describe the roles and responsibilities of federal agencies in their response. At the federal level, there can be considerable overlap in responsibilities if they're not defined ahead of time. Defining the responsibilities helps to prevent what is known as mission creep and an increased overlap of objectives by agencies. Mission creep, as its name suggests, occurs when a responding department or agency responds for a narrow purpose and then, gradually, their objectives change and they find themselves taking on responsibilities that were never originally intended. Mission creep refers to the unintended expansion of responsibilities. While flexibility is an asset, it becomes a problem when resources are committed to a cause for which it was never originally deployed. There are currently 14 federal emergency support functions. Again, it is not necessary to memorize them, but understand the principle by reviewing the list. They include what you see here: transportation, communications, firefighting, logistics, public health, etc. This is a list of functional areas that need to be covered in an emergency. So you can see here there's the ongoing list. And as a side note, I know I said that there were 14, and of course you see a list of 15. A more recent development in FEMA is the elimination of number 14, long-term community recovery. It has been superseded by the National Response Recovery Framework. So the important thing is that you're able to absorb the intent of the ESFs. These are the functions that need to be covered, and each federal agency has a different part to play based on their everyday mission and how it aligns with the individual function area. Each of the 14 ESFs has three things: has an emergency support function coordinator, a primary agency, and a support agency. The ESF coordinator has the ongoing management of that particular function area prior to, during, and after an emergency. Remember our emergency management mission areas: the prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery? The coordinating agency is responsible for those as it relates to their ESF. There is only one agency that is assigned to serve this role for each ESF. Now, a primary agency is related to an active emergency. A primary agency is a federal agency or department that has a significant authority or set of resources that are specifically related to a given emergency. Because there is some overlap in departmental missions, there may be more than one agency that is designated as a primary agency for an emergency. And as its name suggests, a support agency is one that, during an active emergency, has specific capabilities for supporting primary agencies in their response. So I'll show you a different graphic here that will, I think, help put it all into perspective. So what I've attached here is a portion of a table created by FEMA in their ESF Annex. On the left is the federal agency, and on the top are the individual emergency support functions. And each box indicates which agency is an ESF coordinator, as you see with the letter C, which are primary agencies with the letter P, and for the given ESF, and which are support agencies, as you can see there with the S. So let's look at this in a couple different ways. So first, let's focus on a specific ESF, such as number 11. Agriculture and natural resources. So in the first box it shows that the USDA is the ESF coordinator. a primary agency, and a support agency. And doesn't it stand to reason that the USDA would be that involved in anything to do with this functional area? As the coordinating agency, they have responsibility for that ESF full time. In addition, an active emergency related to this ESF would involve the U.S. Department of Interior. The Department of Interior would serve either as a primary agency themselves or possibly as a support agency to the USDA. You can also see that there are a number of other supporting agencies in the case of an active emergency that relates to this ESF, to include the Department of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, etc. So using this matrix, you could name an emergency and pretty much determine at a glance who is responsible for addressing the problem and other agencies that are likely to be involved. It helps to avoid mission creep and the duplication of effort. Let's look at another one. The ongoing oversight of the emergency support function of public safety and security is the United States Department of Justice. Other supporting agencies, depending on the specific emergency, could include the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the United States Coast Guard, etc. Now let's try looking at it just a little bit different way. Perhaps you work for the DOE, for the United States Department of Energy, and you want to know what you are responsible for coordinating full-time and under what circumstances you would be involved as a significant player in an active emergency, or when you may serve as a support agency in an active emergency. And according to this table, the DOE is the ESF coordinator for ESF number 12, Energy. Kind of makes sense. It would also serve as a support agency if there was an active emergency involving transportation or public health and medical services. You get the idea here. Returning to an earlier slide, you can now see that how ESFs actually coincide quite nicely with the other portions of the National Response Framework. Part of the guidance and operational direction provided by the framework is based on which ESFs are activated in a given emergency. The NRF is directly related to federal response to emergencies, but you may recall that I mentioned before that there is an expectation that the state, local, and tribal agencies would follow suit. So to that end, many local agencies have adopted the ESFs as outlined by our national government. Even so, it is not uncommon for non-federal entities to make some modifications to the list to make it more applicable to their individual community. For instance, the state of Massachusetts has 18 ESFs. Almost all of them match up to the list found in the National Response Framework, even down to the number, except, say, number 13. Instead of public safety and security, Massachusetts has gone with military support, presumably to address the involvement of the National Guard. They have also a few additions to the federal list, such as law enforcement, animal protection, and business and industry. The ESFs relate directly to the emergency manager. When a crisis occurs that requires the activation of the EOC, one of the emergency manager's first steps is to determine which of the ESFs are going to be activated. That will dictate which disciplines, agencies, or departments need to respond to the EOC. Not every department needs to respond to the EOC for every kind of emergency. This is part of the concept of scalability, and ESFs help to keep us on track in that regard.